Welcome back to the Movement Professional Podcast. So today I'm going to be riding solo as Corey's away this weekend, and I wanted to keep the flow of the show going. So I was going to talk about cardiovascular exercise today. So if you're viewing this on YouTube, I'm going to go through a little bit of a slideshow just to make the video a little bit more entertaining, but nothing you really need to see. So the audio should work fine on the podcast version. All right. So things we want to talk about with cardio is, first of all, like, how do we define cardio? What is cardio? So it's actually hard to find a very specific definition when you look, but it's generally can be defined as any type of exercise meant to elevate your heart rate. And generally this exercise is considered aerobic more than anaerobic. And aerobic just really means that you're exercising long enough that you have to use oxygen for energy, which the anaerobic version would be that you're using other forms of energy, like creatine phosphagen system. We've done other podcasts talking about the energy systems before, or glycolysis. And that's usually shorter bouts of exercise that feels more like sprints, stuff that you can't really sustain for a longer period of time. So generally the duration really matters here, so that you're doing things long enough that you have to use oxygen as one of the major forms of energy. But aerobic exercise and cardiovascular exercise, I don't believe should be confused for the same thing. So you can do aerobic exercise without really getting your heart rate up much. So like walking could be a version of aerobic exercise, but it really, I wouldn't put it in the category of cardiovascular exercise, not the way that I would look to define it to improve cardiorespiratory conditioning. Yeah, but that's always dependent on where you are and where you're starting. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to think about heart rates and heart rate monitoring to think about how to program cardiovascular exercise to make it very specific to you and where you're at. Back to definitions, the American Heart Association, again, very broad, very vague. They mention moderate intensity activity in their overarching definition of cardiovascular health. And that is basically their quote: your heart will beat faster and you'll breathe harder than normal, but you're still able to talk. So again, not very specific. And then they also mentioned vigorous intensity exercise, which their quote: you'll probably get warm and begin to sweat. You won't be able to talk much without getting out of breath. So again, very big. I think hopefully we can do better in this podcast to be more specific with our discussion about cardio. All right. So I think the key takeaway, though, from the definition is that cardio means heart. We're trying to have some type of assessment of heart rate because that's one of the easiest things to monitor in real time when we're exercising, is to look at the heart rate. There's other things, obviously, that look at cardiovascular fitness and wellness, but while we're actually exercising, I think heart rate becomes key because it's actually quite easy if you get the right tools to measure while you're actually exercising, and then you can use your heart rate to make adjustments. So quickly, the benefits of cardio, like why the hell should we do cardio? Well, because it's pretty much good for everything. It delays all-cause mortality. It decreases the risk of cardiovascular and metabolic disease as well as cancer. And also, if you happen to be unfortunate enough to get any of these diseases, it tends to help you in your fight against the disease, or to stave off death a little, allow you to live a little bit longer with the disease. It also improves sport and functional performance, and tends to improve stress management, mood, and cognitive function as well. So it helps you think better, not just perform better physically. All right. So how do we measure cardiovascular fitness, or how just one look at, like, how do you know what your cardiovascular fitness is? So a couple of things you can look at is your resting heart rate. So it's actually a pretty good marker of your cardiovascular health. And you can see that change over time as you start doing things to try to improve your cardiovascular health. If you see your resting heart rate go down, then that's usually a really good sign that you're doing something that's helpful and you're moving in the right direction. Heart rate recovery is another measurement, and that's just a measurement of how much the heart rate decreases in an allotted amount of time after exercise. So say you get your heart rate up to 180 beats per minute, you can do a measurement where you look at your heart rate in real time as you're resting. You give yourself about a minute, and then you see how much does the heart rate come down in that minute. And it's important that if you're going to measure this, you're going to do it after you've done vigorous exercise where your heart rate actually got up pretty high. You're not going to do it if your heart rate got up a little bit, because it's not going to show the same effect, and you wouldn't expect the heart rate to come down as much if you didn't get your heart rate up in the first place. But if you do get your heart rate up and you're doing some intervals where you're getting your heart rate up to higher levels, it actually could be a really good marker of cardiovascular health to look at this. So just for some numbers there, with a 1 minute heart rate recovery test, average for elite athletes would be your heart rate drops about 23 beats per minute in that minute. If you just have good cardiovascular health, you're looking at a little bit around 20 beats per minute, maybe a little bit over 20 beats per minute. And then normal range for cardiovascular health would be about 15 to 20. Average among non-athletes would be about 15. And then if you have impaired cardiovascular function, you're looking at somewhere less than 12. Another marker that we could look at is VO2 max, which is the maximum rate of oxygen consumption during physical exertion. So this is usually tested in a lab, but you can do some estimates to look at it. And there's a few that you can just kind of Google, how do you estimate your VO2 max? But I would just say this is going to be one of those things that you might look at periodically by going to a lab and getting it tested. But as your overall cardiovascular exercise improves and you're able to sustain higher heart rates for longer with less feeling of physical exertion or less perceived rate of exertion, that's usually a good sign that your VO2 max has improved. But it's often used again in laboratory settings as an assessment of improved cardiovascular health. It might be a more difficult thing to do on your own. So all of these are valuable. You don't have to use them all to measure your heart rate. You can use the ones that your cardiovascular fitness. You can use the ones that are most accessible to you. The last one I'll mention is heart rate variability, because it's become pretty popular of late. Devices like the Whoop app and pretty much all of the wearable apps at least claim that they do some version of heart rate variability testing, and that's basically the variation in the time interval between heartbeats. And the more variability, the higher the variability, tends to indicate more parasympathetic activity, rest and digest activity. So you're recovering better if your heart rate variability is higher. If your heart variability is lower, you tend to be in more of a fight or flight stress state. And it's not always a bad thing to have a lower heart rate variability. But if you're noticing that it's low chronically, then that tends to mean that your body doesn't recover as well from the exercise you're putting through it. And that could be not a good sign, not a positive sign for your cardiovascular fitness. All right, so the next question would be, how much should I do? All right, so just starting broadly with what the American Heart Association offers, they would say 150 minutes weekly of moderate intensity activity, or 75 minutes weekly of vigorous intensity activity, or a combination of both. So again, not real specific. I'm going to talk a little bit more about zone training and how to look at when you're actually monitoring your heart rate, how to deconstruct that into different zones, and we can talk a little bit more about how to think about how much cardiovascular exercise to do. But I think this is a good start, just as a guideline, to say, okay, can we get about 150 minutes of what would feel like exercise where we are elevating our heart rate, and then we can think about how do we separate out the intensity of how high we get our heart rate. What does moderate intensity exercise look like when we're actually taking a heart rate and doing a percentage of a max heart rate? What does vigorous intensity activity look like when we're actually taking a percentage of a max heart rate? So as we talk a little bit more about zone training, we'll come back to that idea about how do we think about vigorous versus moderate intensity activity. All right, so how should we monitor our cardio? I think this is the most important part of this discussion. And for what I do as a physical therapist and personal trainer, this is sort of the most practical, like in the weeds discussion here. And I can tell you personally, it's a game changer for me to have started to monitor my cardio quite a bit more. It made it a lot more enjoyable, but it really improved my cardiovascular fitness from even when I was probably 20 years younger, just because I didn't really have a good assessment of how to look at where I was from a cardiovascular standpoint, and then how to see it change over time. So number one thing I would say is really respect the use of a heart rate monitor. Get a good heart rate monitor. Take the time to get preferably a chest strap heart rate monitor. I'll link a couple of options in the show notes, but the Polar H10 is one I use. I also use a Morpheus chest strap. I'll talk a little bit about Morpheus in a bit, but they're different heart rate monitors. The ones that go on your chest, they definitely give you a better, more accurate reading, and you're able to use them with more versatile activity, in my opinion, and you can use them while your wrists are free, your hands are free. So I do a lot of heart rate work where I'm using kettlebells, and I don't want to have a watch on when I'm doing kettlebells because I'll smash the watch, and I just want my wrists and arms to be free. But I can have the chest strap heart rate monitor. It's a more accurate reading, and then I can put my phone in front of me that has the heart rate on it, and I can actually see my heart rate in real time as I'm doing different exercises. And when I'm doing cardio, and that's the intention, I don't care necessarily about how many reps I'm doing. I don't necessarily care about how much weight I'm doing, but I'm doing some type of combination in order to get my heart rate into the zone I'm looking for. So for me, the number one thing is I have to be able to see that heart rate, because that tells me when to rest. That tells me how fast to go. That tells me if I need to go a little heavier, I need to go a little bit lighter. And so it's pretty much when I'm doing cardio, it's all about the heart rate. It's dictating my pace. It's dictating when to rest. All right. So once we get the idea that a heart rate monitor is important and we start using it, then we can kind of ask the question, where do we start from a max heart rate, or the percentage of heart rate that we're looking to go? Like, how do we know what our goal is from a heart rate standpoint? So typically, if you use any heart rate monitor, and they'll have some type of corresponding app, or there's plenty of apps that will be able to pair with any chest strap monitor you have. So I use the Polar H10, and then the Polar Beat app is its corresponding app. And if you put your information in, they'll ask you your age, your fitness level, how much exercise you do, and they will tend to start you off with 220 minus your age is your max heart rate, which is a standard. So then as we start to look at different zones of training, they're just going to take percentages of that. So I'm 40 years old currently, so 220 minus age would put me at 180. It's about the only math I can do without a calculator. And then if I was going to do, say, what they consider zone 2 training, that's 60 to 70% of my max heart rate. So it's 60 to 70% of 180. Can't do that math without the calculator, but it would basically correspond to 60 to 70% there. Their zone 3 is 70 to 80% of that max heart rate. Their zone 4 is 80 to 90, and then 90 plus would be their zone 5. So everything within that app would be based on what you're starting your max heart rate to be. So my recommendation for my clients, and I did this myself as I was starting tracking my heart rate, was I just started with that 220 minus age, and I went from there. And what I found is it was pretty easy. It was maybe a little bit too easy, but it got me more consistent with cardiovascular exercise, because as I was looking at the heart rate and seeing, okay, like I get to rest a lot because I was getting to my heart rate zones a little quicker than maybe I should at first, it got me in the game. It got me like really assessing this. And then what I was able to do is just say, okay, like I could bump my max heart rate up because I've gone through this, and I've seen that my perceived rate of exertion maybe isn't matching what the heart rate is. So that the next thing to do would be, once you start with that percentage of 220 minus age, you also maybe want to assess something called your perceived rate of exertion, or your RPE. So a 0 to 10 scale, and again, I have this in the PowerPoint, but I can also link it in the show notes, would just be something that goes from 0 to 10. 0 would be nothing at all, so you're basically not moving. 0.5 is just noticeable, so you might just get up and walking around very leisurely, pacing. And then 1 and 2 would be very light and light, and that can correspond to maybe a zone 1 type of exercise. 3 would be considered moderate activity. 4 would be somewhat heavy. 5 would be heavy. So 3 to 5, you might be in your zone 2. 7 is very heavy and 10 is very, very heavy. And then there are the 6, 8, and the 9 are sort of in between fractions from heavy to very heavy and very heavy to very, very heavy. So it's actually very general and vague, but it's helpful to have some type of heart rate number, heart rate zone that corresponds to your RPE, just so you know if you need to adjust that max heart rate. All right, so when you do feel like you want to adjust your max heart rate, you can do that in a couple of different ways. One, you can just up the max heart rate, say 5 beats per minute, see how that feels. Up at 10 beats per minute, see how that feels. See if your RPE starts to correspond more to what your heart rate zones are. If not, the other way that's a little bit more specific that takes your resting heart rate into account would be to use the Cardiovascular formula for your target heart rate. So you're not necessarily getting a max heart rate, but you're just getting a target heart rate. So the formula is basically a target heart rate. You take your max heart rate, which you start with 220 minus age, and then you subtract it by your resting heart rate. And your resting heart rate, you can, if you have that heart rate monitor that you're using, what you can do is put it on when you're first getting out of bed or before you've gotten up and moving, or if after, say, sitting for 5 minutes, and you just get a legitimate like resting heart rate. You put that into the equation. So it's max heart rate minus the resting heart rate, and then timed whatever percent intensity you want. So if you're looking for more of like a 75% intensity, which would generally put you in the middle of a zone 3 workout, which would be closer to like maybe that 7 to 8 out of 10 intensity, then you would plug in the 75% there. Once you get that calculation, then you add it back to the resting heart rate again, and that's going to give you your target heart rate. So I have this formula written down. You don't have to plug anything in anymore with Google. All you do is you go on Google and you look up Cardiovascular formula, and they have a calculator for you. You just plug in the numbers of your max heart rate and just your age and your resting heart rate, and they'll even take care of the max heart rate calculations for you. So I've done that myself, and then just done some math on whatever the workout is that I want to do that day. If I want to go for a zone 2, I'm going to try to put myself somewhere between 60 and 70% as a target heart rate, but it adds my resting heart rate in there, which takes into account my current level of fitness. All right, so that's one option. What I've been doing more recently with clients, though, is actually I might start with that idea of the Cardiovascular formula and just see where some of their numbers lie, but then start to just more simply add a few beats per minute to their starting 220 minus age resting heart rate, and just start to have a dialogue with how the effort in the zone corresponds to what they feel like they're doing. All right, so it doesn't have to be super specific, but whatever you're doing, you want to know what you're doing so you can see change over time. And one of the best ways to see that it's very obvious that your cardiovascular fitness is improving is if you started with a heart rate zone where the beats per minute were quite a bit lower for what felt like hard work for you. So if your zone 2 started at 105 beats per minute, and now it's at 120 beats per minute, and the effort feels about the same, you can pretty much guarantee that your cardiovascular fitness is better. So it's a very objective way to see change over time. And at one of the kind of light bulb moments I had is I was very used to doing strength training where there's this constant goal of progressive overload. You have this objective change that you're seeing by gradually doing more weight over time. But I never really had that with cardiovascular training. I always actually thought of it as more of a speed type of training, but just speed for longer periods of time. So if I would run, I would just try to run faster. If I would, do a bike, I would try to bike faster, go the same distance in a quicker amount of time. But I never really took into account the effort I was putting in to get there. So it was really sometimes just feeling like I'm grinding out maybe more than I had. And it really wasn't as objective for me to see change over time. So using the heart rate monitor, there's so many different ways you can manipulate what your heart rate zones are with different workouts. So you can go higher intensity, you can go lower intensity. And I think a lot of times the secret is that you want to actually spend more time in these lower intensity zones, going longer, but you still want to feel like you're making progress with those lower intensity zones. So, a zone 2, which can be defined as, again, the 60 to 70% of that max heart rate, or it can be you're looking at some combination of that 60 to 70% zone with your perceived rate of exertion somewhere around where you can have a conversation, but your conversation is strained, and you're maybe around that 5 out of 10 level, somewhere between maybe 3 to 5 out of 10 on that RPE scale. So you're kind of combining all of those different elements to say, like, okay, that's my zone 2. But if you see your zone 2 improve over time, like, you need to get your heart rate up a little bit higher and your output on whatever device you're doing. So if you're running faster, if the wattage on the bike is higher, to get to that zone 2, that says that you are much more fit over time. And it's not going to feel like a max effort ever. It's going to be exactly where it is in that zone, and you need to have different ways to monitor that, because guessing often doesn't work, and it certainly didn't in my experience. And I noticed with a lot of my clients, they have an idea that they're doing cardio, but they're not really specific enough. They're not monitoring how much they're doing. So it ends up just being this idea that they have some goals for fitness, and they're getting confused with what they're currently doing, and really don't have any way to monitor change, because they're not looking at like what their current baselines are. So that's my 2 cents on the cardiovascular measuring. But I think it's really important to be more specific on the zone training, the different ways you can look at it. The Polar Beat app that I use has 5 zones. And it corresponds to zone 1 is 50 to 60% of a max heart rate. Could be an RPE of, say, 1 to 2. It's easy. You're easily able to talk. It's usually a walk for a lot of people. Some people, if they're really new to cardiovascular fitness, or their cardiovascular fitness is low, a walk could be pushing you up into 60 to 70% of your max heart rate into a zone 2. There, the RPE is about 3 out of 5. You're usually able to talk, but it's strained, and you're generally able to still breathe through your nose, depending on if you have any structural problems with the nose. Zone 3, you're looking at 70 to 80% of max heart rate. RPE is somewhere between 5 and 7. You're barely able to talk, and to me, it's a mix between nasal and oral breathing at that point when I get into that zone. That's going to be different for everybody, but that's kind of what you're thinking. You're starting to blend from, like, all right, I can't breathe out of my nose anymore. I have to start up in my mouth. Zone 4, 80 to 90% of max heart rate, RPE around 7 to 9. You're barely able to talk, and you're mostly breathing out of your mouth at that point. And then zone 5 is 90 plus, 9 out of 10 RPE. You're unable to talk, and it's very heavy, panting, oral breathing at that point. All right, so those are the zones. And then now we can kind of go back to the conversation we had about how much should I do? And there's definitely not a direct answer, but if we start with what the American Heart Association discusses, that 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity, 75 minutes of vigorous intensity activity, I would put zone 2 training, zone 2 and zone 3 in that moderate intensity activity, and I would have the majority of the work be zone 2. So a good goal is 150 to 200 minutes of zone 2 training weekly, but it really, really does depend on where you're starting. So, and I think that's really gets lost sometimes in the fitness discussions, is we have all these guidelines that the American Heart Association comes out with, and College of Sports Medicine, you see these guidelines, and it's oftentimes way too much for people because they haven't gone into it. So they can't jump right into those guidelines. But a guideline is nice as a goal, a long-term goal, right? So, but the long-term goal it's just the standard. You can absolutely surpass it. And if you're, an endurance athlete, you're going way past that. But you can really think about it over time as, what fits into your life. But maybe have that standard that's set at like 150 minutes of zone 2 training be a nice goal to work at over time, and just see how your life changes, see how your cardiovascular fitness changes. you see how your health changes, because there's all these benefits of cardiovascular exercise. And one of the major ones that I feel more than anything is mood. It can be just one of those things that I didn't want to directly tie into that, but about 15 years ago I gave up alcohol. So cardiovascular training is all the drug I find that I need. Like if I'm not feeling like I'm in a good place, after 30 minutes on a bike in zone 2, I'm just a totally different person. So I think that's underestimated by a lot of people, because they'll look at cardiovascular training as something that's just for weight loss or for calorie burning. But give it a try to improve the fitness there, and see how things change. So that would be a good starting point. If you're already there, that's great. You can do more. It really depends on what your goals. If you have some other activity that you're looking at, so say you're getting into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you're still playing a sport, basketball, something where your cardiovascular fitness is pretty important. You monitor what you're doing currently outside of your sport, and gradually add a little bit more on. And I would say the thing to do the bulk of seems to be that zone 2 training, maybe blending into a little bit of zone 3. And then where the vigorous activity comes in, I think, is like you're looking at your zone 4, zone 5. Now, I think my opinion would be 75 minutes per week of zone 4, zone 5 is way too much. So I'm looking at zone 5, maybe like 5 to 10 minutes per week, and then a blending of zone 3 and zone 4 at maybe 25 to 30, up to 45 minutes per week. It really depends on what your recovery is looking like, how you feel from a fatigue standpoint. So we're not going to be super specific there, but I think it's important to, if we can backtrack from what the American Heart Association's recommendations are, I think one of the best things to look at is that zone 2, maybe getting 100 to 200 per week, and then building that up over time, and then thinking certainly quite a bit less when you're going with the higher levels. So what I tend to see practically is a lot of people will sort of be in a no man's land when it comes to this zone training, where if they're doing zone 5 training, they might be doing it way too long because of just some of the exercises they choose, and don't realize that there's a downside to that, where you're going to wear yourself out. You're doing more than you need to do for cardiovascular health at that point. And you see that a lot of times in group exercise communities, where there's a lot of competition to push as hard as you can every time you work out. And that, there's benefit to that, certainly, that can improve your fitness, but it may be unnecessary for what you're looking at from a cardiovascular health standpoint. And it also can be a deterrent to a lot of people looking to get into exercise, thinking, oh, I have to work out that hard every time I work out. And I think, for me, I was always an athlete, but I really did not like cardiovascular training until I started monitoring my heart rate, because I was always felt like I was suffering and I was working too hard for longer than I needed to. So I had no problem doing sprint work as long as it was short. And what I realized is, as I'm monitoring my heart rate, I could rest more frequently, just because I'm able to get my heart rate up pretty quickly. But to sustain it for long periods of time was difficult. So using the heart rate monitors to tell me when to rest made such a huge difference, to allow me to do just more volume of cardiovascular exercise, so that I could actually start to then improve the amount of time I could maintain heart rates for. All right. So I think, going too hard, you're doing more than you need to. And a lot of times there's going to become injuries and overuse that comes from that. But it also, again, it can be a deterrent that's unnecessary for those that are trying to get into exercise, feeling like they have to work out that hard. Like that's what they're striving for. And it really never needs to be what you're striving for. And then, there's the understanding of, that zone 2, what that feels like, and to be able to find a way to do a bit more of it. Oftentimes that feels pretty good for people as they start to get into it, but you oftentimes need some type of monitoring to know, okay, I'm actually not going too hard. I'm right where I need to be. So what I've seen, when I have people, clients in the clinic use heart rate monitors, is they're surprised how quickly they have to rest because they've gone above their zone 2. And it's sort of a little bit of a conversation and sometimes a discussion about, like, that's okay. You don't have to be, moving and exercising the whole time. The rest break counts too. So if you get your heart rate up and you're resting and letting it come down, that time in that zone still counts as your cardiovascular activity. And the goal would be that it's actually harder for you to hit your zone over time because you are, better, your fitness is improved. So it takes more output to get to that same heart rate zone. But in the interim, as you're working on your fitness, you rest as needed. You rest as the heart rate zone tells you to rest. And that consistency of doing that starts to just show you that, okay, now I have to put a little bit more output into it in order to get the rest that I'm looking for. But I think it becomes a way of gamifying cardiovascular exercise, making it more entertaining, and it allows you to have more variability of the movements that you do. So the other misnomer I think that you see with cardiovascular exercise is that people equate cardio with certain machines. So if I'm on a treadmill, I'm doing cardio. If I'm on an elliptical, I'm doing cardio. If I'm on a bike, etc., I'm doing cardio, where that's not necessarily the case. You could be on a treadmill and really not doing much to elevate your heart rate. You could also be on a treadmill or a bike and just not be doing enough time on there in the heart rate zone that you're looking for to get the benefit that you're looking for. So there is this combination of the sweet spot of the intensity that you're looking for and the amount of duration that you're in that zone that really is, where you're going to get the most benefit of cardio. So you do have to have some way of monitoring it. And the machine itself doesn't magically put you into a better cardio place. So the other side of that is that you now have more options just by having a heart rate monitor on. You can turn kettlebell training, you can turn body weight training, you can turn barbell and things that would traditionally be thought of as strength training into cardiovascular exercise. And you're just using the heart rate zones to tell you when to rest and when to work. And for me, starting from a little bit more of a strength and power background, that was music to my body, because it just really like fit right into my wheelhouse. But it also allowed me to see where there were times where I was working harder than I needed to, and it helped me find a flow of, okay, this is going to be cardiovascular today, more cardio exercise, but I'm using weights. And that's where I feel like there's a blending between cardio and metabolic conditioning at that point, where you are doing resistance training, but you're doing it in a manner that is purposely meant to elevate your heart rate, and you're varying up your exercise as much as you can. So what it starts to show you is you're able to actually use heavier weights to get you into different cardiovascular zones. And your output now is you're looking at, okay, can I use a heavier weight, but it still stay in this zone 2? That definitely shows this combination of fitness where you have strength and you have aerobic fitness and cardiovascular fitness all together, which to me, if anything's going to improve metabolism from an exercise standpoint, it's going to be that combination. So hopefully this was useful. And hopefully I wasn't rambling too much, but all I can say is, like, the cardio is a game changer for you if you start monitoring more things. Some people may, think differently about that, but I think that's been the biggest thing in my career of late, that change of just having myself and having clients monitor more of their cardiovascular endeavors. And it kind of definitely shows you where your holes are, shows you what you're not doing enough of, shows you what you're doing too much of, and gives you a structure. And that structure doesn't tend to be something that feels limiting. Like if you kind of are over structuring your nutrition, for instance, you might feel like you feel really limited. But when you start to structure your cardio, it actually, I feel, makes it feel more obvious of what to do. And it actually, I think, makes it easier as opposed to harder, which that's always a good thing. And it's certainly important. So if you can, make it easier and it makes it more doable, it's going to be quite useful. All right. Hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, You can comment. This will be up on YouTube. It'll be up on Instagram. So please comment with suggestions and questions. I'm more than happy to ask. And if you have any questions or suggestions for future content, please put it up, and I'll be happy to add it in. See you next time.